I'm Colleen Lye. I'm the chair of the Asian American Research Center, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this public conversation. It's about craft in the time of crisis with some luminary writers whose presence I've managed to insert myself into on this panel by virtue of being chair of the center. So I will mainly be here to tell you some business things at the start and then hand it over to Jeff, who's going to frame out the context of the panel for us. So first order of business, please turn off your cell phones or mute. There will also be book signings by our amazing writers afterwards, which is made possible by Eastwind Books. A big thank you to Harvey Dong for arranging that. I also want to thank the UC Berkeley partners who've made this event possible. Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies program in the Department of Ethnic Studies, the Department of English, and the Arts Research Center. We sit on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, land that was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the university's founding in 1868. Consistent with the university values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples, including and especially the people of Gaza and the West Bank. I offer this recognition in the hope that such words will become less and less empty now that words are being banned, though this should not fool us into thinking that words divorced from context are necessarily always actions in themselves. Indeed, I think this is what is a core part of what we're here to talk about today. And with that, I would like to introduce Jeff Chang, who's going to be telling us about the framing for our panel. Jeff Chang is a writer, host, cultural organizer, and last but not least, a UC Berkeley alum. He's the author of several award-winning books. So I had to seriously cut down this bio, folks. So I'm sorry, Jeff, if I'm just giving the really concise edition. Okay.
Shorter, yeah.
He's the author of several award-winning books, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation, Who We Be, and We Gonna Be All Right. He's the host of the Signal award-winning podcast, Edge of Reason, and KLW's Notes from the Edge. His latest book, Water, Mirror, Echo, Bruce Lee and the Making of Asian America, was just released. I'm really excited that tonight will also be an opportunity to talk about this new work. So with that, Jeff, will you come up here and
Can I just do
tell
it
us
from
what we're
here?
about? Oh, sure.
I'm
Yeah.
just, yeah.
All right,
I don't
stay seated.
saving my steps for later. Thank you so much. Thank you, Colleen Lye, Dr. Colleen Lye, who is being exceedingly modest this evening, who I remember reading as an undergraduate and being incredibly influenced by her work and still am today. So it's an honor to be able to be hosted by Colleen and the Asian American Center, Research Center, as well as ADS, Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies, Department of English, and the Arts Research Center here at UC Berkeley. So let's give it up for all our sponsors. So we've been wanting to have a conversation, the four of us, for a while. And we've been trying to figure out, okay, like we could even do this publicly, but what are we going to talk about, right? And the thing that those of us who are artists, who interview a lot of artists, talk about a lot is that when non-artists talk to artists, they like to ask artists about what they made, right? What's the meaning of what they made, or what's the content of what they made? And when artists talk to artists, they like to talk to each other about how they made it, right? The process of things, the craft of stuff, right? And these days, whether it's artists talking to artists or non-artists talking to artists or non-artists talking to non-artists, I think the conversation these days is really about like what the hell is going on in the world right now, right? And so tonight's conversation, we kind of figured out a way to bring all those things together. And that's the idea of craft in a time of crisis. And so, along with Colleen and I have the amazing and deep honor and pleasure to be able to introduce to you two of my great writing heroes here, Terisa Siagatonu and Cathy Park Hong. So I'm going to embarrass you both a little bit more and give a formal type of introduction to you both. So Terisa Siagatonu is an award-winning poet, teaching artist, and mental health educator from the Bay Area. As a queer Samoan woman, she has performed at the White House, the UN Climate Change Conference, give it up, and the Asian Pacific Triennial. She was a 2012 Champion of Change honoree by President Obama and a 2022 Emerson Collective Fellow. Her poetry has appeared in Poetry Magazine and on Button Poetry, CNN, NPR, and more. Teresa is the co-editor of this amazing book that you can get out here from Harvey and East Wind, We the Gathered Heat, Asian American and Pacific Islander Poetry, Performance, and Spoken Word. And this is the thing I'm most excited about. She's the author of a forthcoming young adult novel and her debut children's book, The Vastness of Us, is coming out next year on Penguin. Terisa Siagatonu. And Cathy Park Hong. Cathy Park Hong. Cathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, won the National Book Critics Circle Award, and landed her on Time's list of the 100 most influential people of 2021, where she absolutely slayed in those pictures. Did you all see those pictures? Like, she was amazing. Influential and slaying. She is also the author of 3 poetry collections, which are all amazing. Engine Empire, Dance Dance Revolution, which was the winner of the Barnard Poets Prize, and Translating Mo'um. Is that how you pronounce Translating Mo'um? Yeah, okay, Mo'um. Her work has been widely published, and she has received the Wyndham Campbell Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and an NEA Fellowship. She is a full professor of English at UC Berkeley, and she's working on a new novel. Yes, please give it up, Cathy Park Hong. So, friends, we are in a moment. We are facing an ongoing genocide. We are seeing Black people continue to be lynched. We are seeing our migrant friends, our refugee friends, our immigrant friends being rounded up by masked, heavily armed emissaries of the state. We're seeing attacks on the university. We're seeing a war on science and knowledge and facts. And we're seeing, like just yesterday, a gathering, right, of 800 plus generals or something like that, where the so-called war secretary is lecturing these folks on the warrior ethos, which apparently consists of shaving your beard, doing a lot of pull-ups, right, and being a man. Like this is the warrior ethos. And then the president gets up to say that he has mobilized and called all these folks here today, called all of the generals together to work on the war within, the folks who are invading the folks who are the threat to America, the real threat to America. We're in a moment of crisis. And, you know, in some ways what we do is, we like to think, I think it's important, but in some ways what we do is put words together, right? And so I think the question that we were stumbling about with, and maybe the question that now I'm gonna ask, and then I'll be silent for a little while we figure it out, is sort of why right now, and why right now, right? So there it is. I'm going to drop the mic and let you guys pick it up and answer this stuff.
I don't mind going first. Talo Falava, hi everyone. Just a quick housekeeping thing. Is Bricky and Ellie in the room? Okay, so they're still on their way, because I was gonna say their seats are available if if they were already sitting somewhere else. Also, this is a communal fan if you're like really in need of. This is how we take care of each other. Yeah. Why right now? Why right now? As a poet, I was reflecting on how I wrote my first poem 20 years ago when I was a first year at UC Santa Cruz in my dorm room. That was also the time in which I read Can't Stop, Won't Stop for the first time and fell in love with Jeff's work. Aw. um, and I haven't stopped writing since. Yeah. And I would be remiss not to name some of the writers who helped make possible my own ability to language and to voice what I think matters to not just me and my poetry, but our communities, our collective liberation. Um, and one of those writers is for sure Toni Morrison. And I think about this essay of hers called Peril, in which I'm paraphrasing some of her words, in which she says, dictators, authoritarian regimes are fools, but none are foolish enough to relinquish full power to their writers, to pursue their creative instincts, to say and speak the whole truth. And they do that by using tactics like surveillance, censorship, this propagandized way of punishing folks for speaking up, right? I think we're also in a place, as an artist, I'm completely oriented towards thinking about connection in very particular ways. So much of my work as a poet is about contextualizing these moments and scaling it back to simple questions like, how do I just get through to my own people real quick? And I think a lot of us, I've been talking to a lot of friends, a lot of my Black friends, a lot of my Latino friends about how we're all having in-house meetings with our people, trying to figure out how the hell to get through to one another and to each other. And I speak as someone who is deeply tied to my organizing work and commitment to the Pacific, but also as someone who comes from a very ultra-conservative people who have been deeply influenced, impacted by Christian nationalism, by US imperialism, by war. And so maneuvering my way through that using art has both been the most soul-giving experience that I've had the honor of doing as an artist, but also the most heart-wrenching and most difficult thing I've ever done. And so it's in moments like this where I have to be near and in community with other artists and writers. One, to keep my own sanity so that I don't feel like I'm tripping. To be a sounding board for one another of like, am I seeing what I'm seeing? And I need you to confirm that for me in community with one another, be it through our own art or just in these spaces, because we're also being confronted by this anti-intellectual war telling us that we're not seeing what we're seeing, right? And so I'll pause there to make room because there's so much that we want to talk about, but that's a little bit about why I write and why I write now.
Hello? Wow, it's louder than I thought. First of all, I just have to say I'm so honored to be here with my idols, all of you. Terisa, Jeff, Colleen. I am so, and I just think all of three of you are the most perfect people I can have this conversation with. Because it's going through my mind all the time too. And I'm glad what you were saying in the introduction, you made a really important point that we've been in a 24-hour new cyclone since, I don't know, 2016 or something, but it seems to somehow have even accelerated even more so, such that the conversations that I used to have about art and writing, and I used to be so sick of the conversation, writing in politics, what is the role of writing in politics? We don't even have that conversation. It's been completely sidelined. And I think I also have that sort of doubts myself because, Jeff, you weren't supposed to tell anyone I was working on. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. That was a joke. But I'm working on a long form book that requires a great deal of isolation. And I question myself, like, why am I doing this? I should be like I should be in front of an ICE vehicle, and just like trying to stop it somehow. Like, it should be about direct action. This is too indirect. I'm not helping. And I think there's a lot of anxiety that writers feel right now. But I will say that the government would not be attacking all of our institutions related to the humanities if we deemed us irrelevant or unimportant. Like even getting rid of the NEA, right? That's like a penny. It's not even a penny in the federal government. Going after museums and, of course, kind of completely trying to dismantle the university system. It's a little strange to be at that point where we're a lot like countries that we used to, that our parents or that we ourselves were from, that had dictatorships, right? Like Chile or Venezuela or China or Vietnam. And really, you know, in those countries, or Russia, in those countries where poets were thrown in prison. And now we're getting to that point, right? I mean, it's not far-fetched. At the time when I was reading, when I would read about these writers, I was like, well, that was another period. We are in that period now. So therefore, it is absolutely essential. Writers are absolutely important more than ever, and we cannot be afraid. We cannot be afraid, but we also, there are different approaches to that. You know, I think for me, as a US born citizen, I can afford to be more direct, right? And I do think, and be in the forefront, but then there are other ways if your citizenship is in question, if you're a green card holder, if, you know, if you're in a vulnerable, marginalized group, where you could write through indirection. As Borges once said, metaphor is the mother of oppression. There's also a long tradition of writers who wrote, you know, indirectly, and those are the books that are the most timeless, you know, that we really, really remember, like Osip Mandelstam, Paul Celan. I'm thinking of poets, Kim Hae-soon. This is why poets matter so much, you know. But I also think we have to change the way we think of the writer, because for so long we have been so kind of inculcated by this Instagram model, right, where writing and arts have been so individualized, and we think about writers, we're thinking about rebranding and so forth, and like what you were talking about, there has to be sort of more of this kind of collectivized action happening, collectivized mutual aid communities, which there have always been, but I think it's more necessary even now, especially as our institutions are under attack. We need a commons and an undercommons, and it's a way of offering moral writing is to offer moral clarity. It's to offer. It's also space to grieve. It's also a way to slow down the 24-hour cyclone and actually really think deeply and question what's happening, to give meaning when they're trying to get rid of meaning.
I think a lot about, maybe this is Cathy, you and me and Colleen's era a little bit more, but I think a lot about how we've formed a lot of, not to exclude you, Terisa, I'm just saying it's a different thing. Boy, I'm really messing up tonight, man. No, but seriously, like, and my old friend Julie here is in the house, and I just think about, like, we did zines, right? We created these communities around music, around poetry, around film, around dance, around theater, and we had these undercommons, undergrounds, we called them back then, right? All these different types of things, and these days, of course, you know, part of what social media was about was people who experienced those types of things and then decided to try to figure out how to monetize it, right? And so now we have to go onto Instagram or TikTok or different types of platforms to be able to have these kinds of conversations that we might have had, quote unquote, in secret back then. And so I guess I just sort of wonder, like, is it time for us to maybe try to think about what it looks like to have networks that are not monetized in that kind of a way, that are not they're not, literally when we post something on Instagram, it's no longer, we no longer own that, right? Meta owns that content, quote unquote now. And that feels like we gave a lot of stuff away.
I want to talk, and by the way, Colleen, you haven't, I want to hear your response. But anyway, it's true. It's like, I think a lot of the kind of social media has really completely transformed this kind of more idea of an artist community. Like there was this, I guess, Greg Bordowitz, who is also of our generation, although I think I'm a little younger than him. He said, he was saying, in light of social media, there's no counterculture anymore. And I thought that was really interesting, that there's no, whether that's true or not, it's obvious, it's fighting words, right? But that's something he said, and because it's hard to be hidden. But now we have to be hidden. But even like if you think about social media, I used to fucking hate Twitter, right? But like even Twitter offered a space. It was still a town hall where a lot of poets and fiction writers would get together and bitch and gossip. And like, yes, there was a lot of nasty canceling happening there, but it was still a kind of a gathering of sorts. Now it's been completely, now Twitter is like a Boschian horror show of maggots. And then and Instagram is not really a place to have a conversation, right? You just have photos. And they're also even wiping out the information space, and you're getting surveilled. So I do think that we have to think differently. We have to also, I have to say, this is also very important. The institutions that I use to critique and criticize are under attack. So there's like this mass consolidation of publishing companies. So it's under one. So what would happen when Trump sues Penguin Random House? What's going to happen? There are no other, they're just eating everything up. This is why capitalism and fascism go so well together, right? Because you have these these massive consolidations of companies. They get sued, they negotiate with Trump, and there's a silencing, there's no platform because they've eaten up all the indie presses, all the smaller presses. And this goes for museums, this goes for musicians, any platform in which artists and museums are. So we also have to rethink how we're going to disseminate our art and our writing, whether and doesn't exclude the internet. I think it definitely does, and can include the internet, I don't know where, but also just the collectivizing that's happening outside. But Colleen, I want to hear from you. And also, Jeff, I'm curious about why for Jeff and Colleen, let me just say that. Colleen, I'm curious about what you have to say as a scholar and one of the most, I think, like pioneering thinkers that at the Next who thinks about Asian American studies in connection to Marxism. What does the role of the critical of the theorist and the scholar play now? I'm very interested in knowing that, and that connected to you, Jeff. You have, I don't know. You've inspired me. Can't Stop, Won't Stop. That is like one of my Bibles, right? And then also, you've been writing intelligently and powerfully about race for so long, like We Gonna Be All Right, about desegregation, resegregation. What do you think? How are you trying to speak? What are you saying about this time through Bruce Lee, or are you trying to make that connection? So I guess those are two questions. So, Colleen.
Okay, so, wow, okay, so much to follow up on. Absolutely, I think imperialism's boomerang is fascism at home. I follow like Hannah Arendt that way. I follow a bunch of thinkers who are making the connection between what's abroad and what's at home. And I think this is and I also follow my ancestors in the political movement for Asian American identity, which I want to get to a little bit later when we drill down a little bit on this amazing book on Bruce Lee as an allegory for Asian America. But which is to say that to try to come back to the question of why right now? What does it mean to do it from what feels like the narrow space of scholarship? Like I'm the most boring person on this panel because like I write scholarship, right? I write, okay, no, self-hating academic, but like, it's true. Like, like you could say like the literary critic is like the wannabe writer, but you're also writing for a professional audience. You're writing for a more restricted audience. You're writing for other scholars, emerging scholars, graduate students. You write in a kind of specialized language that you hope advances knowledge, but that is not that legible for everybody else. And that is a world that is under attack because universities are under attack, because knowledge making in general is under attack, from the sciences to the humanities and to the social sciences. And so the reason why this connects to the earlier point about Asian American identity is that when I came to Berkeley in the 1980s as an undergraduate, when I first met Jeff, actually in the 80s, we overlapped by a couple years. It was weird, because I realized that university was my witch mountain. Like Berkeley was my witch mountain. I don't remember if you remember that old show where like there's these like orphan kids and they don't know where they came from and they felt like they didn't belong. It's kind of like a Harry Potter of like the earlier days, like I don't belong here. Like where are my people? And then, of course, that was LA. So, sorry, LA people. But then I came to Berkeley and I'm like, oh my God, this is my witch mountain. And it's not just that it was a NorCal thing, but also I think it had to do with the university is a space of immigrants. It's a space of international people. It's a place of idea exchange that is super cosmopolitan. It's a place of difference. And in the 1980s, it was also a place where there was a huge struggle at the site of English departments over multiculturalism, over literary diversity. And I would say it was a place where the multicultural project of the 1960s moment was taken to the forefront at the site of literature, which is why there are all these like canon debates. And it was the first time when, NEA was canceled and NEH was canceled by William Bennett. And, you had this long fight by the neocons against like the cultural remaking of the university. So it was like a whole world of struggle. That world is the world that's under attack now, and it has been for many years. And so it's a small world, but it's a world that is connected to all the other institutions that are under attack, which is picking up on like the irony that Cathy was mentioning about like, oh, for a long time, like the big publishers are the people you're attacking and you want to be for the small presses, but now the big presses are under attack. Well, for a long time, we're like, oh, you see, military industrial complex, home of the atom bomb, all these terrible things. And so like, we were always in this mode until like the 24-hour cyclone of, is it abolition or is it reform, right? And like reform seems to simply be like the institutional path where you kind of like maintain the holding pattern of a kind of liberalism that's not enough, the liberalism that's always pushing up against a certain set of limits that proves to be neoliberalism, that still seems to be complicitous and like racial capitalism and, all the bad stuff. But now it's like, that's not it. Like a 24-hour cycle doesn't give us time to debate reform versus abolition because we're like now making micro decisions at every single level. Like in this 24-hour cycle, are we going to maintain or dismantle this particular structure that was laid in place by generations that is like a liberal structure that still represents a certain confluence of intelligence, of like structure. The structure reflects research and teaching in a kind of multicultural mission, I guess, embedded in that DNA. And that's the thing at the university that's like in motion right now. And so that's the craziness I'm feeling. So why right now it's hard to write except for like alarmist memos, like, no, don't do that. Yeah.
You guys have put your finger on something, which is that we're in a really weird moment because we were in a lot of ways the anti-institutionalists just a few years ago. And now we're the institutionalists and the anti-institutionalists.
Yeah.
Now it's kind of a strange thing. I actually wanted to ask this question of you, Terisa, picking up on two things that you kind of both are.
Jeff, you didn't answer my question.
No, I'll do that. But I think we're on a thread here actually that I want to kind of ask about, which is this idea of where are the countercultures now, right? Are there countercultures now? And the other question, which is the bigger question, this is the Kana's in the audience. This is a Kana question. Kana question is, how do we build a mass movement again, right? How do we, like, the question that you bring up about audiences, to me, right, is a question that I think we struggle with as writers in maybe a different way than the publishers struggle with it, right? The publishers are trying to find an audience for our book so that they can sell our book and they can make their 75% or whatever that they're making. You know, we're getting 15% and the stores are getting 10%. So just breaking it down for y'all. So we think of audiences though as the folks that we want to move, the folks that we want to convince, right? The folks that we want to engage in this process of trying to build something different, a different world. So when you bring up the audience question, it's really interesting to me. And it relates to the countercultures question and the institutionalism question, which is how do we build it back up? And I wanted to ask you that question first, Terisa, because you know we've all been in the countercultures and stuff. We're like we got all our countercultural stripes and blah 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 blah. But like I'm really interested in you, a digital native, like how you see counterculture, thinking about it, right? All right, I'm messing up a lot, right? I'm just like
I received that.
Okay. But yeah, no, just and maybe we can open that up to this larger question of audience building and like how we're getting to a majority again, now that it feels like we're so far away from that, even though I think we're not, but that's a whole other story. So how do you think about like the places where you're building community, where you're moving people, how that's getting to change on a big level?
Totally. I received digital native. I think also because I reflect on how I came into poetry through slam and through spoken word at a time in which I came in with a class in which spoken word hit YouTube in the early 2000s, at the height of Def Poetry Jam, and button poetry and whatnot. I was part of that class of spoken word artists whose work was hitting Tumblr and going viral and learning about virality through these means in which I was being consumed, and producing work at the same time. And naturally, over the course of those years, I've been thinking a lot about the growing sizable following I have online because of it, and that catapulted during summer 2020 at the height of the state-sanctioned violence towards Black folks in our communities nationwide, in which folks were just flocking to profiles who were doing the work, and folks who could crystallize the moments for us. And a lot of those folks were artists, were poets, were writers. And oftentimes I struggle with this relationship I have with social media, seeing the sheer power of collectivity that brings us together on a global scale. Like it was the first time in which I was radicalized to do more in my own activism when I saw Palestinian organizers teaching organizers on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, how to get tear gas out of their eyes by using milk, like through Twitter. I was one of the people bitching on Twitter at that time, but also just like glued and like so taken by the collective effort to be something amidst all the terror imposed on to us by the state. And social media has been a balm in those ways, but also I think there's something really deep about my brain really feeling fried at times by the consumption of social media, but also trying to resist having a politics of refusal and resist misery in ways where I don't want to buy into needing to necessarily take full-on breaks or give into the self-care models that exist right now, because I know so much of my understanding of care and collective care has always come from a village mentality, that I need to stay connected, I need to stay abreast and whatnot. And I hear oftentimes through folks who reach out to me through social media how impactful something I posted was, and which really knocks me out of like feeling jaded at times of like, does this even matter? Like, does this post even matter? Does it matter to even be saying shit right now? And it does a lot of times is what I've learned over the course of 2 decades now. Where do the other countercultures exist? The other side of it is I also come from a community who is chronically not online when I think of my community in the Pacific. So I come also from a people who are on the front lines of our climate crisis right now, who is not online necessarily talking about the latest sound bites of what's happening, you know, in our local governments, but are saying our sea levels are rising and our islands are being impacted first and most. Our land has been the site of nuclear testing for decades, and the US has not cleaned up shit. And so, like, so much of my drive also comes from, like, I can't rest up and I can't let up because there's so many of my own youth and my own people who are just doing some like grassroots on the ground at the shoreline kind of work that I know social media helps with, but it knocks me out of a paralysis I feel like I get into sometimes with being a digital native, but also being native and being indigenous to people who also count on our writings and our writers and our artists to clarify these moments and to remember them, because oftentimes we come from a community that's often relegated to the margins of the world, quite literally, right? And so putting forth their message and really championing what their work is oftentimes starts in social media, for better or worse, but how to utilize that in ways where you don't lose yourself and you don't lose hope has always been a balancing act of sorts for me.
Yeah, I think that's very thoughtful. I think there are two ways to think about. Well, first of all, are we thinking about audience in terms of being a writer or being just someone, you know, who being someone who lives in this country and cares about what's happening and trying to stop it? I think those are two different issues. I think for me, but I think my answer is the same. You know, there are two ways of thinking about audience. One is the very local, which you're talking about, very local community. That's audience, which is really important to just for your soul, right? And that is how I think of my role as a poet. And then there's the larger audience, right? Because you want to kind of connect all the different groups together. I guess I see myself, my role as an essayist, for instance, as reaching that larger audience. I am curious, though, about, to bring it back to Asian Americans, since this is the subject, kind of one of the topics that we're talking about. One difference I would say before Trump 2.0 and now is that there was a lot of discourse about race by race scholars, by race writers. I wasn't entirely satisfied with those conversations. I felt they were absolutely necessary, but I think they were also very much taken over by social media, in that there was this kind of balkanization of racial discourse and racial solidarity. Even
Can you give an example of what you are talking about?
Well, you know, for instance, like this kind of discourse of you're being anti-Black, you're being anti-Asian, you're being anti-this, so that the way that people were defining themselves, their identity was based on, was a kind of reactive, was one that is reactive, that immediately put you on the defense, right? And I think there was a lot of conflict, you know, even among the left, not just the liberals and the left, even among the left. And, you know, in thinking in terms of, but now I feel like we're not even, Black and brown people are the ones who are being disappeared. But we're not, Black and brown people right now are not leading the conversation, it seems like, because there are many reasons I'm not even beginning to say. But this is just what I noticed, not compared to before Trump 2.0. You know, I think that like there needs to be, like, in terms of Asian American, just to talk about who is in Asian American, who's not Asian American, is not enough for me. I think we have to think about race in a much larger umbrella. Decolonization would be one way to think about it. And that's why when you were talking about Berkeley during the 70s and the 80s, which was another reason why I was inspired to teach at Berkeley, is that kind of solidarity, anti-imperialist, that sort of multicultural third world front really was a model, could be a kind of model as well. And I was like, I think maybe going back to, or not going back, or bringing that to the forefront is one way of thinking about that. But I'm also wondering, like, right now, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I think like sort of the way we have talked about Asian America is needs some real revisiting, you know, reformulating in the way that it's been kind of completely co-opted by social media and capitalism and all of that at large. But I'm very curious about what both of you think about what Asian American is now.
Okay, I'm going to jump in on that and actually put the pressure on Jeff. Before I put the pressure on Jeff to answer this big question that's on the table, I think that this is something I've been grappling with for a very long time, being situated in Asian American studies and also post-colonial studies, which is where I got my training. So thinking about coloniality and race together was always my approach to Asian American studies in a kind of international frame, and that's where the racial capitalism stuff comes in as well. So it's not simply a kind of domestic kind of census identity for me, right? So I feel like our current moment with deportations and expulsions based on clear sort of racial profiling on the one hand, and then the absolute front and centerness of settler colonialism as something that we all have to grapple with throughout our liberal institutions in terms of acknowledging what's going on with US foreign policy, right? And therefore bringing to the fore all the very deep-rooted reasons why settler colonialism is really hard for liberals and progressives to confront, who are US people. Those two things on either, within the AAPI umbrella, right, have always represented this like crazy jamming together of two like kind of seemingly completely opposite identities, like the immigrant, the people of immigrant descent, and the people of indigenous descent within one category of US territory. And so that's been the crazy contradiction of that identity and trying to forward that as a political thing. So that's one thought. And like, how does the current pressure around what does it mean to take seriously land back on the one hand? What does it mean to take seriously needing to not expulse people who don't belong to some kind of white supremacist idea of US identity? On the other hand, how does that present a kind of challenge for Asian American politics? Okay, so that's one set of thoughts. Why I think that, Jeff, you need to answer this question, is because I was really struck by a place in your book where you use Bruce Lee to remind us that Asian American identity was always about inserting yourself into a narrative of solidarity, It's not a negative notion, it's like a positive. And yet the positive is like in motion. And so what does that mean? And how, can you just talk a bit more about that through your Bruce Lee example or,
Yeah, I mean, I was really inspired by Cathy's work and Viet Thanh Nguyen's work in thinking about some of these types of questions. And also, quite frankly, in thinking too about all the conversations that you and I have had about the place of Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians in all of this. So thinking about how these coalitions are built at moments in time and how then culturally we actually sustain them in these different kinds of ways, deliberately, intentionally. In Hawaii, it begins as a labor struggle, and then it's reinforced by the ties that people build through food culture, language, pidgin English, sort of intermarriage, all these different types of things. It starts as a political thing, right? Everybody needs to be able to get up off the plantations, get their rights, and overthrow the Haole minority, like oligarchy. But then the culture kind of builds up around that and that kind of thing. And this is something that is part of my family history and experience. It's just, kind of how we grew up, and thinking then about all the different terms of kinds of permutations that takes when then that translates to the continent, and all that stuff can take us on a whole other panel that we could talk about later. But I was thinking about this in terms of the contingency of these coalitions and how they're built and rebuilt over time. And then thinking about that in the moment in which Cathy's writing Minor Feelings, Minor Feelings is coming out in the middle of the pandemic, and people are like, we need this because we're trying to figure out who we are. A couple of years ago, we were like, I don't even think I'm Asian American, right? And now it's like, no, I'm Asian American. If I step out on the street, they're not going to see me. They might think I'm Chinese and attack me for that, but that doesn't make me Chinese American. That makes me Asian American. And so we need like models to be able to help us to understand what that actually means. And your book hits at that particular moment with all the brilliance that you had brought to it, and leads us in these new directions to be able to think about the fractures as well as the ways in which these things like come together. And then Viet's work, thinking about solidarity and expansive solidarity, especially after October 7th, and what that means. Palestine is in Asia. Everybody should read this article, right? Just so thinking over and over again about what it means to assert solidarity and to assert, we come to think of it as identity, but it's an assertion. It's a proposition that we make, that we all convince ourselves of, and that we build. So the question is, what does it mean to be Asian and or Pacific Islander? I'm both, in America in the next 50 years, and knowing that the ideas that might have funneled and created the origin of Asian America, this idea from the 1960s to now, that those conditions have completely changed, and that we have to rethink it after immigration, after class division, and all these myriad types of ways. And so the Bruce Lee book becomes this thing of like, well, shit, this is the most famous Asian American who's ever lived, right? Like, everybody loves Bruce Lee. What does it mean? What does his story mean? What does it mean that he traversed the Pacific, right? What does it mean that he was born in the US during the time when the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in place? What does it mean that he forms his identity by living in segregated communities with other people of color and poor white folks? What does all that mean? And does that mean that if I tell that story in a different kind of way, I can engage those friends and relatives of mine who are like really angry in this particular moment, so angry that they become reactionary, that they become Asian American nationalists, right? Can I reach those types of folks in that? And this is, so in that way, like your question about audience earlier, that's the audience that I wanted to reach. That's the audience that I want to get to. And everybody else comes along, that's awesome. Like, that's really, really great. But this is for us. So that's sort of what I was trying to write into. And I think right now, I think of one example of this coalition building, this sort of political coalition building that has the potential to re-energize us. And it's not perfect. And it's very East Coast based. And so it doesn't make space, I think, for the Pacific in a way. But it's Zoran's campaign, right? Because if you look at Zoran Mamdani's campaign, the foundational coalition that he built it upon was working class Asian Americans. He said, free buses, rent freeze, right? Healthcare, like Palestine, right? And people said, ha, you'll never make it in this town, young man, right? And the working class Asian Americans go out and organize folks. They're like, yeah, rent freeze, yeah, free buses, yeah, healthcare, right? And they form the fun. Everybody says it's the DSA. Props, I love you all, DSA. But the people who made this happen, the coalition that got it started, were the working class folks, the working class South Asians, the working class Chinese, the working class Korean Americans, the working class Asian Americans in working class Asian American neighborhoods that were making that happen. The DSA comes in a little bit later, right? And then they cause all kinds of stuff. Love you all, DSA. But it was the working class Asian Americans that found that really built this. And so this campaign then suddenly has oomph, and everybody can move to this because that's an agenda that everybody can get to. But it starts with this Asian American working class ideal of what freedom can mean in this particular moment. That's fucking powerful.
Yes.
That's fucking powerful. If we could think about what that means in Western settings, which are more diverse, which are maybe more class mixed, right? Which are much more, like we have much more of a strong Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian presence here. If we're able to bring in and think about settler colonialism and what that means in this particular context on a continent, like who knows what we could be doing, right? Instead, we're sort of weaponized by like the quote unquote moderate Dems out here in the Bay Area to fulfill their agenda. And we show up, we give them money, and we don't get too much back in return for that stuff, right? And I'm not gonna name any names because I have friends that out here who'd be like, who do you mean? And I'll be like, I don't know, really. But I'm just saying, right? These are the possibilities, and that's partly, you know, how the book connects up to the shit I've been thinking about otherwise.
I was going to ask you about Mumdani because you wrote an article or you did a podcast? You wrote an article about Mumdani, and that was the first thing that I noticed about it. Like the working class Asians were the biggest demographic. I believe they were the biggest demographic who got behind Mumdani, which again is completely unheard of. That you would think that like, you know, these like working class like Muslims, you know, it's you know, South Asian, East Asians would vote for a socialist, and some of whom who actually voted for Trump even, you know. And so, and media likes to say, oh, it's the white hipsters who carried him to victory. No, it was the working class Asians, which Democrats have for years overlooked. And he and Mumdani managed to mobilize that. How do we expand on that energy?
I don't have a direct answer for that yet, Cathy, but it's so true, Jeff, and what both of y'all are saying. Like, I think so often about how we don't have enough class solidarity. And that's so much, again, I'm gonna reference Toni Morrison. Her work is just so important to how I understand my own and how I understand the world. That she's right when she says that racism is such a distraction, that it distracts us from doing our work. That I'm at a point, as someone who's been organizing in the Asian Pacific Islander community for more than half my life, and who is also the granddaughter of a man who was on the committee who coined the term Asian American Pacific Islander for the US Census Bureau in 1978. I now stand both at an impasse about separating us, but I actually more so stand in a place of, I actually don't care a lot of times what you call us as long as we come for US imperialism. Like I don't, like even as y'all are talking about Asian American affairs, I'm like, yeah, let's talk about this shit. Cause I also have some things to talk about with our own people, like, and it's all connected and I don't feel threatened. Like I just feel like, yeah, like we need to be talking about the Pentagon. Like we need to be making direct connections. And I'm also speaking as someone who's the daughter of a US Army veteran who served this God forbidding country for 20 years, and who I'm always getting into it with my father about how he was exploited in joining and enlisting in the military. But the way to have those tender conversations and not be and not have a politics of disposability either is really fucking hard. Because I want so badly at times to just shake my own people by the shoulders of like, wake up. Because, you know, so much of the US's military business is done in unincorporated US territories, and one of them being my own island, American Samoa. American Samoa. Come on, like, what the fuck? Or even, you know, these conversations about Bad Bunny, you know, performing at the Super Bowl, and people are like, how can you be against it because Puerto Rico's a US territory? And I'm like, y'all are so close to getting it. That's not the exact conversation, but nor is that what his music's about, right? And so but there's just so much of the like the treacherous business of US settler colonialism and this colonial project that's done in the waters, both the Pacific and Atlantic, on islands on purpose because they're unincorporated, unrestricted. A lot of business can be done there that isn't as lawful to be done here. That's so much of where my poetry is based, in terms of, you know, something that I learned from the now late, now ancestor Assata Shakur was how to be an internationalist. That to care about the freedom of my own people is to care about the freedom of other communities as well, and to have an internationalist lens around that. That every time we cut off a tentacle of imperialism, we get closer to our own collective liberation. And so I think about my people's freedom as much as I think about how so many of our people are foot soldiers, like for so much terror that's caused across the world, even as they're victims of it. I don't remember what the question was, but oh, we need more class solidarity, or at least racial class solidarity beyond just staying stuck in the tensions of representation, Asian American, Pacific Islanderness, because we're not getting very far. And so, like in 20 years, I see those categories being rendered obsolete through our purposeful collective solidarity work that we have to be doing actively, and it's going to be fucking uncomfortable, but it must be done. So that I don't want to sit here in 20 years from now talking about, well, are we Asian or Pacific Islander enough? And like, yo, the US is terrorizing our people worldwide. 800 military bases worldwide, and a majority of them are in the Pacific. And I hate that. And I don't want that to be the narrative pushed forth about who Pacific Islanders are, right? And I want alternative pathways for our young people to do art and not just consider being part of ROTC and then shipped off to terrorize another people a world away, right? I'll pause there.
On that note, I think we should open up to Q&A.
I was just curious what like this talk towards solidarity looks like in like the practice of writing and poetry. Like how do we begin that solidarity work when it's so hard to cross these class and like racial lines?
I can start. Thank you for that question. It really helps for me personally to write in community. And so a lot of my closest friends, artist friends, are poets that I've known for years. And there are times in which we have accountability writing times within seasons in which we're just sending each other work. We're editing for each other. We're being sounding boards for one another. I personally also lead writing workshops at times in community with folks, a lot of times students across the Bay and other places. And so really just gathering where writers are, and also reading helps a lot, and paying attention to like my favorite writers and what they're reading, and seeing where the connected tissue is in those ways. But for me, it really does start with writing with other writers and being in not succumbing to writing in isolation too much, so that you have an affirming place to land and to evolve and to question and challenge things in community with folks.
I agree with everything that Terisa said. I would say that to have even one friend is starting a movement, right? It's like, or having some form of solidarity, whether it's a writing friend or a personal friend. But it's also really important as a poet in this time to give yourself space to write, You know, I think there was that term self-care that was thrown around a few years ago. I find writing to be a form of self-care, you know, because not only are you kind of, for me, it's like the self-care is making sense of the chaos around the world. And I don't know what I'm thinking, or I don't even know what I've retained until I write something down. And so first of all, that solidarity comes from within, right? And then from that, it's sharing. That's really important. Like, and that's, you know, and sharing with another friend and with other friends, it starts there and then it just moves from there. I think there's a lot of, there's so much fear. We live, you know, there's so much fear and despair, you know, and this is also just really why art is so important, is the kind of how holistically it, you know, it gives us moral clarity, and it gives us a place to be, as it sounds cheesy, but it gives us a place to be human, you know, in all its complexities.
There is a, oh, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
go ahead. Yeah.
There, when, so writing is maybe the most solitary art form, right? You do it in your room and that kind of thing. You might do it around a table at Charlie May's, but most people do it in their rooms or that kind of stuff. And I contrast that with like me coming up in music and hip hop culture, and being in freestyle sessions with I didn't freestyle, but my friends, you know, all did, and I, you know, I used to spin until I realized my friends are much better DJs than I were, and they used to talk all the time about getting open, and what getting open meant was, this is taking you back, right? Like getting open meant like being able to open up your mind so that you could just channel whatever energy from above through your brain into straight out through your tongue, right? And just be open, right? And what I always loved about that metaphor was that it suggested that that you were just a vessel as an artist. You were just a vessel that you were opening yourself up to have water poured into you, and then you were just like giving that back out, you know? And what I realized, I think, over time was even in writing that act of being in place, or even having lunch with you all, right? Or writing at Charlie May's together over some amazing empanadas and chai, is just, it's life-giving, and that's another way of getting open, right? So that like my work would be better just by being in place with other folks. Cathy was part of a group that, I got this from Cathy and Viet's, can I talk about this? Okay, so Cathy and Viet had this thing last year in San Jose, and Viet kind of had an aside talking about how he had recruited, was it you, Gina Apostol, and Leila Lalami to be his readers. I was like, wow, that's hella brave, you know? And he like got from his first draft to his second draft, which is like, oh my God. And through their like loving, kind, and also brutal, like critique of it, right? And so I was like, oh, I need Cathy to do that for me too. She needs to just like, and so Cathy, Bonwin, Kamal Bell, and Adam Mansbach were my firing squad. But writing for the first time for me, like with others in that way, made the book what it was. Cathy at one point was like, are you gonna talk about like all these kids that have grown up being called Bruce Lee? Because I'm just like, you know, yeah, Bruce Lee. And then of course, there's all these kids who've been stereotyped on the playground as Bruce Lee's, right? And so how do you deal with that, right? Like, how do you deal with that, Jeff, is kind of what Cathy said. In a very nice way, in a very kind way. I was like, oh, shit. But it made the writing so much better, and that helps also get to this deeper part of like, how do we connect with those folks, like, right? Like, and I wouldn't have even known that. So what I guess I'm trying to give you is like maybe a little bit more of an example of how that solidarity can actually produce better art and better connection, not just with your friends over good food and coffee, but with the folks that you're writing to and the intentions of who you want to reach, if that makes sense. Yeah?
You make me sound like a dominatrix.
No, but everybody everybody like knows that you are like the best at this.
Yeah, well, I'm Asian. I'm hypercritical. It was like, no, but I just loved being part of that community, and I think that's so important because we're living, especially now, where like poetry, fiction, especially poetry and fiction, are being completely minimized, demonetized. You know, people are like, "What? Why does it?" Poets get this all the time. I mean, even before Trump, you're like, "Why do you write poet?" Like, you know, you're always being asked, like, you know, "Oh, I used to write poetry when I was 16." As I was to say, you should be over this already, right? So this is also why you need your friends, your community, to show that, to center you as a poet, to center poetry, and to take you seriously, and to take yourself, and that is so important. To be in a community, you're taken seriously. Poetry is taken seriously. All you need is a few friends.
And then you're there for them, and you're creating the world that you're wanting to build, right? So it's a microcosm of a larger project.
Yeah, tough love. It's like there was okay. So there's so many. Which one? Okay. Okay, take a bunch. What do you mean take a bunch? Oh yeah, let's have a bunch.
And Jeff, you're a lyrical dude. Uh,
That's Roberto Bedoya, everybody. Legendary.
well,
Legendary
whatever.
supporter of the arts in the East Bay and in the Bay Area.
Well,
Thank you, Roberto.
to implicate myself, I'm a policymaker, so I often think about where is the poetics of policy, and as the poets who love obviously the power of a poetic inquiry, how does that shape, how does that influence the rules and regulations of policymaking? That's my homework assignment.
Are we stacking questions? Yeah. Okay.
Two other questions. There was one.
Thank you to the panel, and also I'm also a policymaker, so I really appreciate that question. We all clustered together, I guess. Hearing, I guess, you talk about solidarity, something that I've been thinking about is what I recently heard, where solidarity can be thought of as an exercise of necessarily reaching across difference and kind of choosing maybe who you are in community with and who you're negotiating that with. And I think that within my own family, you know, I think it's been mentioned that there's a lot of complexity, there's a political spectrum. I'm coming, you know, for my own people all the time to try and educate. So I was just curious, like, how you thought about difference, like which gaps are bridgeable, like who you bring in, and if there are gaps that are not able to be in solidarity with.
Wasn't this like an Ezra Klein Ta-Nehisi Coates? Look, yeah, yeah. Two more.
I was wondering how you kind of see writing as like a connection to ancestors, as people who maybe don't have a lot of like written records. I'm half Chinese on my dad's side, and it's been really difficult to find any records at all past my grandparents. And yeah, that is like something that I find like difficult to navigate. But I feel like writing can sometimes connect and bridge those gaps, but yeah.
At a convening of organizers across the US and Atlanta earlier this year, a lot of what was discussed is during these times, as we always say, the tactics that used to be common and used to be the bread and butter of organizing, such as like not performative in a derogatory way, but performative in a descriptive way, protests, disruptions, messages of statements of solidarity, etc., and how those tactics don't seem to work in an era of rising fascism. And so I'm curious, as cultural workers, as creators of culture, as academics, how do y'all see your role in this shifting landscape? And in what ways do you think your own tactics might need to change?
Okay, okay. Wasn't there another one? I thought there was one right here. Yeah.
Quite the last go around, so speak up or further.
Okay, thank you for the generous panel and the allowance of the last question. My question is about how much of that work that you all described of solidarity building, connection making, and collective liberation can be achieved by revolutionary form in art and not just content. Because, I mean, this is especially pertinent, I think, with the last question, where a lot of content in art is also being censored and surveilled. And I wonder if sedimenting form in some way or thinking about the accomplishment of form could be a way that we think through this problem or think across this problem. I wonder what you all think, especially as writers, as poets, and as people invested in all forms of literary output and also music. That's very important. Yeah. Thanks.
My question kind of builds off this previous one, and thank you so much, panelists. Earlier, it was mentioned that we need to rethink how to disseminate our writing and how this can include the internet, but not sure where. So I'm also thinking about these models that were put forth, like looking at the third world, but thinking also about form. What comes to mind is kind of the Dada use of photography, which is interdisciplinary space. So I'm thinking about this idea of the creation of new spaces to circulate ideas and how that works across writers, artists, musicians, and what that perhaps amalgamated space might be.
He asked questions of YouTube. It was about the poetics of policy. It wasn't about the policy of poetics. It was about the poetics of policy, not the policy of poetics. No. So now we're going to play hot potato for the next 10 minutes and not answer the questions. I think that Roberto was asking you two about this. But I'm really, really interested in these last two questions about form and what that could look like, and if form can yield new spaces for us to be able to think about how to make work, how to build audiences. I'm not sure what it looks like though, but yeah, Cathy does.
I can look in the past. There's a whole history of writers, fiction writers, poets, artists, like the kind of mediums and forms that we take for granted rose out of fascist regimes, Brecht, right? Bertolt Brecht, Theater of the Absurd came from, right? World War II, Hitler. I am actually very much interested in this question of form and fascism in form, not just content, especially for those writers who, are in such a precarious state that if they say write about or make work about Palestine, they feel targeted. And this conversation is happening right now in the classroom where students are afraid to write about what they want, short story writers, because or they're afraid to even put it on canvas. So, or like just put it online because it could be trailed. And this is a really real threat. So form can be practical, like using burner laptops or going back to hard copies. The way we're using AI, right? Blue Book is coming back because of AI. You could also say the same thing for hard copy, using hard copy as a way to just, so it's almost like going outside outside the internet for that. But I think of like even Chile, during Pinochet's time, one model was CADA, this group CADA. It was a Chilean group of artists and writers. During all these countries had long periods of totalitarian rule, and for the first five, like in Chile, I think for the first 5 or 10 years, no one was making anything, and then they started making things again. And Zurita and his fellow comrades, the people who he was making work with, like they would fly a plane over Chile and distribute flyers with poems on it, or they would distribute. There was like milk to working class people, or what are other examples? I mean, it was a lot of these sort of actions, that was a way of kind of getting public attention that you see a lot in art now, right, in contemporary art now, but it started from a place of practicality because there was no other way. They were like, all the museums were shut down or sanitized, so they couldn't show their work in museums and galleries and so forth. So they took the public sphere. That's what they did. So there's a lot we could do in the public sphere. It still exists. And think about ways in which you could activate the public. And that is, I think, a place of real risk and imagination. I'm not excluding offline life. I'm not excluding online life. I think it can happen in online life too. Substack, whatever. But like, that's there are tons of examples in other countries, in our own country, in Black history. Look at Black writers, Black artists, what they've been doing all throughout history. Black music, that is form right there. What form can do under the constraint of white supremacist fascism. Why don't you? I'm also curious because you do performance. I think performance is absolutely crucial in thinking about form.
Absolutely. I think the summation of what I was gathering from the questions actually brought forth my own understanding of the power of cultural change and cultural practitioners, as someone said. And I learned a lot of that wealth from Jeff's work in cultural strategy, in which some of the heart of what I carry with me the most from what I've learned from his work is that cultural change always precedes political change, or oftentimes precedes political change, that our politicians, our policymakers and whatnot don't necessarily lead our greatest forms of transformative change. They oftentimes follow the lead of artists, educators, community leaders, organizers, activists, and that oftentimes folks are in politics some of the times, but all of us are in culture all of the time. These are direct words from your work. I'm just quoting you. And I have carried that with me for over a decade, because it has made clear so much of my own understanding of my duty as a cultural practitioner and artist. And what it also brought forth was that we need more stories, that we are powered by stories more than so many things, and that at the times in which we see someone putting their neck out and speaking so loudly in the face of this fascist white supremacist regime, it's often the ways to quell that fear is that we need more of us speaking with them. And I know that sounds just so like we need to be all together, but I'm serious about like we need to be really strategic and meticulous about being clear in our voice and in what we put forth and how we construct words, and we need to have a flood of them at all times, always. Go ahead, Cathy.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I just want to quickly add to that, and then just very quickly, Judith Butler, she was like, I started talking, she said, what artists and theorists do is, what they do is prevent the foreclosure of our future. And I think one of the ways they do this is, writers and artists do this, is offering alternate models of the future that that politicians are not able to imagine because many of them don't have an imagination. But I do think, but I think this is like what is really, really kind of what we're really craving. And I think Mamdani really offers this, is in the left, if we're talking about policy and politics, it's not just about, oh, we're against fascism, or we're like, or let's reach an agreement. It's offering a vision of the future, as improbable as it is. And I think that's one kind of poetics. But isn't that, what is that? You lead with, you campaign with poetry and you govern with prose. Yeah. Oh.
Wow. Okay. So I'm wrestling with the question about the performative politics, the inadequacy of performative politics at a time when there's no one to receive the signal, because the agents in charge at the level of high state power don't care, right? So, and how that disappointment in the performativity of politics and the kinds of actions we're used to, at least since the revolution should be televised starting in the 60s, and believing in the importance of mass protests to move the needle. The difference between that kind of investment in symbolic acts and culture work is different from the kind of culture work that you know, my co-panelists are kind of emphasizing, that's obviously is still important. And that culture work, of course, art, but also the way in which in the 60s we're also taught to think about it, the importance of a cultural revolution in which culture does, the lesson that culture does precede, cultural change precedes political change, and you must change the culture. Our dilemma is that cultural work of that kind is slow. Changing those attitudes are slow. That's slow. We don't have the time, it feels like, to do that because everything's collapsing. And so I feel like the dilemma is the importance of hanging on to, first of all, different kinds of cultural work, the different temporalities of that, whether it's like the street cultural work or the classroom cultural work or the writing studio cultural work, but also finally that we're signaling not the leader, the charismatic leader above who's going to save us. And we're lucky if we have a Mamdani or an X or somebody who can, or a king who can come along and be that charismatic leader and can speak poetry and move the masses. We hope for that. But we can't depend on that. That's like contingent on history, right? So what we need to do is signal each other. And that to me is part of the solidarity work. I mean, education, teaching, writing with each other. Teaching is a form of collaboration. You're like bringing along a student and helping them co-write. In the classroom when you're teaching, you're like thinking together, and that teaching need not be a formal classroom. It's an open classroom. It's signaling horizontally. And so I feel like that's the solidarity. That's how you connect the solidarity with the craft, which is a horizontalism of education. So that's what I got.
And yeah. And I think, Sunny, like your question about how tactics need to change under fascism, I don't think it's tactics. I think it's strategy needs to change under fascism. And that is to say that we've all like talked about these different types of tactical approaches, right? But the problem is that we're not strategizing, I think, at a high enough level. You know, we're not strategizing at a mass level. That's why Mamdani's example is really, really interesting. I mean, again, like not to invest all of this importance in just, you know, a figure who's ultimately going to be somebody that we have to struggle with if he gets elected, but to say that strategy can include the electoral politics realm, we shouldn't write that off. It should absolutely be led by culture, and that we have to be able to think about it in terms of mass. We have to be able to think about it in terms of majorities. And I feel like the promise of the last decade were all these movements that actually, like all the work had been very slow, and then we had these inflection points. Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, you know, the Mauna. Like these were movements that people have built carefully foundationally for many, many years, intentionally for many, many years. And then it hits an inflection point, right? Occupy hits an inflection point, and suddenly inequality is the #1 issue. And inequality that Occupy, don't want to blame Occupy for it, but Occupy is what Trump eventually understands the significance of more than the institution of the Democratic Party, right? And so my point is strategically, we shouldn't be thinking smaller at this point. We should be thinking larger. We should be thinking integratively. We should be thinking in terms of how all of these things from our little writing groups to, you know, the work that folks are doing on the ground in different campaigns, say the Working Families Party in California, Prop 50 or whatever, how all of this type of stuff fits together. And that's not to say that we're trying to create a totalizing kind of vision of the world. It's to say that we know what we want. We want a better world, and that's what we're moving towards. And so to your point, right, about Judith Butler, right? Like the active voice part of that is that we're building the world. And the strategy is what is going to get us there. And the tactics can change under the different points. But I think that the problem right now is that we're not thinking about how to win. We're thinking about how to maintain our grants with our funders. We're thinking about how to maintain our credibility with the community leaders that we want to impress. We're thinking about how we maintain our access to the museums. We're thinking about how to maintain our relationships with our publishers, right? That's what we're thinking about. And we should be thinking about how all of this stuff serves a larger purpose.
Viva Revolution.
Viva.
Thank you so much for coming to join us with this conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.